and welcome to Cuppa with a Scientist, a podcast by Loughborough University that interviews a different scientist each week about their academic journey to the top. We will discuss how they went from a confused teenager choosing A-level and equivalent subjects to a leader in their field, with plenty of weird and wonderful stories in between and golden nuggets of advice for those aspiring to get into science. As well as keeping your ears and brain entertained, we hope this podcast will dispel the myth that all scientists wear white lab coats and give you an insight into how vast the world of science really is. And because the makers of this show are painfully British, we'll be doing it all over a good cuppa. But before we get started, a quick bit about me, your host. I'm Meg and I'm a PR and Communications Officer at Loughborough University, and I'm also an aspiring scientist. I made the tough decision to return to university 2 years ago to pursue my love of biology, and I found podcasts to be an incredibly helpful resource when making this decision, though slightly field specific. From health sciences to social sciences, we'll cover it all in this podcast and show you how vast science really is. And hopefully you'll pick up a few tips and tricks along the way to help you on your way to becoming a scientist. So stick the kettle on and get settled in. Joining us for today's episode is Andrew Chadwick, Professor of Political Communication and Director of the Online Civic Culture Centre at Loughborough University. Most of Andrew's research explores the internet and newer media and how they relate to four broad areas of political communication. That's political mobilisation, political engagement, news and journalism, and deception and misinformation. He's also the author of the award-winning The Hybrid Media System, Politics and Power. But more on all of that later. So hi, Andy, welcome to the show. First of all, the important question, what mug have you gone for today and what are you drinking?
Hi, Meg. Thanks for having me. I've got a mug that's got lots of, strange illustrations of frogs on it, and then labels, agile frog, climbing frog, all kinds of illustrations of frogs. It was a bit of a tricky one for me, this, because I do have a sort of geeky, jokey mug, which has got a kind of statistical joke on it, which my wife got me, and it says, there are two kinds of people in the world, and then it says, one, those who extrapolate from incomplete data, and then there's no two. So the joke is that, you know, there's no second kind of person. But I thought that that would be quite difficult for me to use because I'm often accused of that kind of thing in my own work. So it's something that I often do in my own research and writing, is I'm often accused of extrapolating from incomplete data. So instead I chose this mug, which actually has cute little illustrations on it. And my wife bought me that one as well, and I've got a lot of fond memories of it. I've had it many years, and when my daughter was very small, she really liked it. She's a teenager now, but she really liked this mug and used to sort of laugh at it all the time. So that's my mug, and I've got water in it. So yeah, that's about it.
I very much like the mug, as somebody that's a big fan of frogs. And also, sticking with the animal theme, I've got a little draft mug today, and I've got a tea in it, so a bit of caffeine to keep us going.
Excellent, that's a nice one.
Thank you. And I've asked you to bring an artefact with you that relates to your work. Have you got something you can show us, please?
Now I have, and now it's rather big, and I'll hold it up to the camera. Hopefully you can see it. Now, this is a painting, quite a famous painting actually, and I'll explain what this is. This is a painting by Marcel Duchamp. Now, Duchamp was a kind of, avant-garde modernist artist who was very active from the turn of the century, the 20th century, through actually to the late 1960s. And this painting is called Nude Descending a Staircase, and it was first shown in Paris in 1912. It's now in the Philadelphia Museum of Art in America. Now, at the time, Duchamp was kind of a breakthrough artist in the Cubist tradition. I really like this painting for philosophical reasons. What I like about it is that it sort of shows movement, but in the form of a still painting. So what Duchamp was trying to do with this painting was to capture what it's like to show movement in a kind of frame by frame way, you know, the kind of juddery kind of motion, to kind of mimic what was a really important development at the time, which is really the birth of cinema, the moving image, film. So what I like about it is it kind of fuses movement, but in a still form. So it's a hybrid image that really captures, I think, that sense of excitement in the early 20th century when cinema was developing. And it's a kind of cheeky reference, really, to an invention that was made, I think, in the 1870s by one of the pioneers of the moving image, who was a person called Edward Muybridge. Now, Muybridge invented this device, which was a kind of series of glass cylinders that, if you put light through the cylinders, would project a moving image onto a screen. And he called it the zoopraxiscope. Kind of weird kind of label. He was a sort of wacky inventor. But that was the prototype that led to the invention of film. So film, as we know it, as the analog thing before digital, series of frames on kind of perforated strips made out of, kind of cellulose. And what happened during that period when Duchamp was doing this painting was a huge explosion of cinema, and the rest is history. I mean, we wouldn't be sitting here today with, recording this podcast without this kind of breakthrough. So when I've given talks over the years, anybody who's been to any of my talks will realize I often use a lot of art, often modern art, abstract images. I've used this one a lot, because I find these things kind of useful for communicating abstract concepts. So, if I'm talking about something like hybridity in media, I often think it's good to have some text on the slide, but also to kind of show an image that encapsulates the concept, because in the social sciences and humanities, a lot of the time we're kind of using metaphors, we're using different ways of describing the world that are not obvious in ordinary language. So I find art a really effective way to communicate that, which is why I brought this along. Obviously, I wish this was the original, but it isn't. It's a poster that I've had framed. But yes, that's my artifact.
I like it. Thank you very much. I didn't expect to have art and science coming together, but I'm very glad it has.
Well, that's what it's like.
So you're an expert in political communication. Can you explain what that entails, please?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about political communication as a field of study is that it draws on inspiration. It's inspired really by different social science subjects, but it brings it all together in one kind of subfield. What I'm interested in, what all scholars of political communication are interested in, ultimately, I think, is how power and influence work in the world, and what difference media, by which I mean all types of different things, whether it's a media format such as television or radio, but also media technologies such as the internet or the mobile phone, whatever it is, how media matter in this, but also the other aspects of communication, such as whether it's visual or textual or spoken, and of course, things like persuasion, persuasive language, those kinds of things. It brings the whole thing together. But fundamentally, I think every scholar of political communication would say there is really no power in the world without communication. And so to understand the world, societies, things like social inequality, why some people are more powerful than others, why some groups are more powerful than others, you need to understand communication. And political communication, I would argue, is probably the subfield of communication studies that really puts power and influence right at the center of the analysis. They all do it in different ways, absolutely. All different approaches to the study of communication do this. But political communication does it, I would argue, most forcefully. And the disciplines that it draws on, well, it kind of draws a lot on political science. So the study of politics, the formal study of things like institutions, political parties, presidents, prime ministers. But it also draws on sociology, the study of social relations, social structures. It draws on psychology, so how people reason and make sense of the world and our frailties as human beings, often in that regard. It also draws upon other fields, history, for instance, and its understanding of change over time. So it's a classical sort of subfield of the social sciences, but it's also interdisciplinary. It draws upon different strands of thinking in the social sciences going back, as far as you like. I mean, all the way back to the birth of philosophy in the ancient Greeks. So yeah, that's what political communication is.
Great, thank you. And you've kind of touched on it a little bit there, but why is this an important area of study?
Yeah, I think, if we want to understand the reasons why decisions get made in ways that favor some social groups over others, I think we need to understand how communication works in that. So to give you an example, I mean, something that I've been thinking about lots about recently is the role of communication in government, particularly around difficult policy areas. So just to give you an example of why we need political communication to kind of get under the skin and really understand how power operates. You might have heard the controversy over the last few years about the government's plan to, in its own words, build 40 new hospitals by 2030. Now, this was a big announcement that was made. I think it was first made in 2019 during the general election campaign by Boris Johnson. And it's been unpicked in various ways by journalists who sought to kind of hold this rather grand statement to some kind of scrutiny. What does it really mean? Because it might seem straightforward to most people to think, oh, well, building a new hospital, it's, you start with a green field, you put a big building in it, you staff it with people, you call it a hospital. But in the world of political communication, it's never that simple, because the government decided on a definition of a hospital that didn't rely on that very simple notion of building a hospital on a greenfield site from scratch. Instead, it issued all kinds of different policy statements and declarations and clarifications that meant that the definition of a hospital went from simply refurbishing a wing of an existing hospital through various different sizes of project, all the way up to building a new hospital. And over time, it became obvious that the government was trying to present its hospital building program as being more ambitious than in fact it was. So, you've got a background in journalism, you know how important it is sort of getting to the facts. The Guardian ran a story, I think in 2020, where they said, well, look, the definitions don't seem to align with what most people in ordinary life would consider to be a new hospital. And then the BBC, with its reality check team in 2021, ran another big story where they contacted all of the heads of NHS trusts, and they found also a document that had been published by the NHS, which had expressly instructed press officers to refer to any refurbishment or extension of an existing hospital or the building of a new wing on an existing hospital as a new hospital. So I think that's a really good example of how important strategic use of language is in everyday decision-making in government, in public relations, in all kinds of spheres of life. But we as citizens and we as researchers, I think, have a duty to try and think carefully about how these kinds of strategic uses of language can be used to manipulate in some circumstances, to mislead, to distort in the interests of the pursuit of power. And I think that for me, that's where it all begins and ends. How can we hold people to account? So that's just a little example of something I've been thinking about recently, the 40 hospitals case. And as I say, there's been some fine journalism in this regard that has unearthed these rather inconsistent approaches by government. And I hasten to add, it's not just a question of the Conservative government. I mean, all politicians of all stripes engage in this kind of often very strategic use of facts, and I think we have to try to expose these kinds of things and then put them in a broader context of how power operates in our societies.
I think that's a really good example, the hospital case of kind of political communication and how this comes into play. Have you got any examples of where there's been like misconceptions or assumptions about what political communication is, or when you tell somebody your job title, have they assumed that you work for an MP or something like that?
Well, now that's a really interesting one. It's fascinating actually, because I've worked in my old university. I worked in a political science department, so it was a department of political science and international relations. However, at this university, I'm in a department of communication and media where political communication is a really important part of what we do. I've sort of experienced this from both sides, actually. When I was in the politics department, I would often get, when I was running, undergraduate admissions, which I also do at Loughborough University as well, we could talk about that maybe later. I often got applicants who would come up to me at open days and say, well, I want a career in politics. That's why I want to do political science, and that's why I'm interested in media and politics and political communication. And I would say, well, that's great. That's absolutely wonderful. But our job, I think, as political communication scholars, is not necessarily to train people to go into politics to communicate well. That's part of it. But it's also about them communicating ethically as well, and with a sense of social responsibility. And I've always believed that. But you do get that misperception when you talk to people. Sometimes you'll get, the remarks. They'll say things like, "Oh, so you're here to kind of, teach the spin doctors and to make it, to make life easier for the politicians, so you can train them how to be great communicators, so they can get what they want." And I always have to say, actually, no. Most, in fact, I'd say vast majority of political communication scholars around the world see their job as one of, citizenship. Ultimately, we're here to act on behalf of citizens, to enable them to understand power. And so that's a common misconception that I've come across over the years. I mean, from the other side of it, in a department of communication and media, sometimes you do get the occasional comment from students in particular, and this is quite an interesting one. Perhaps you get students who want to do communication and media as a subject of study, and they'll say things like, "Oh, but I'm not really interested in politics." And then they'll give you kind of 10 or 15 minutes worth of explanations of cultural forces, social forces, critiques of stereotypes in the media, and all kinds of things that are, in my view, deeply political. And that, at the end of the day, everything boils down to something, that is political. So often what I explain to students in particular in communication and media is that actually all of the ways that you think about, what you're exposed to on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, or whatever, all the ways you think about how representations in films, for instance, that you might watch all the time, how all of that works is equally a question of political communication. It's just that you don't see it like that, because maybe what you're thinking about is formal politics, where you've got prime ministers and presidents and parties and leaders. So I think what we need to do, and I think that's one of the advantages of our field that makes it so interesting, especially the way we do it at Loughborough, is that we need people to think expansively about what is political. And then when you get this message across, I think the students then realize that actually, that there is a lot more politics in the study of media and communication than they previously realized.
I think that's a really good insight there, because this whole show is about dispelling myths, and I think political communication, you're right, there is this myth that it is hard politics, MPs, prime minister kind of thing. So really interesting. So we will move on later to talk a bit more about your research, but before we do, we like to do a bit of a kind of quick fire round to kind of understand how you've got to where you are today. So I can't imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you always wanted to be a professor of political communication. What did you want to be when you were younger?
You know what? I had absolutely no idea that I even had a potential academic career, let alone becoming a professor. I grew up in the northeast of England. I come from a working class family. My dad was a plumber. My mum worked in a clothes shop until she, gave up work at the age of 21 to look after me and then my brother a few years later. I'm the first generation of my family to go to university. I had no relatives at all in my family that had ever been to university. So when I was younger, I had the idea that I would probably end up working in something like local government or something like that. When I was at school, I remember I went to a fairly ordinary school. I mean, it's a good school now, but it's a fairly ordinary school in the middle of my hometown. And the teachers were kind of dealing with all kinds of different ranges of ability. And I knew that I didn't really want to go into a manual labor kind of job. My dad had spent a long time, actually had a big influence on me when I was a teenager. And he spent a long time trying to convince me not to go into the, family business. I say the family business, it was him and a van and some tools, and that was it. Driving around, fixing people's bathrooms and central heating and whatnot. So the nearest I got to it was probably my dad was just saying, do your best at school and you'll get a job where it won't be a manual job where you can use your brain. And that was a big deal for me. So it all unlocked really when I went to sixth form college and did my A-levels. And I just had a completely different experience. I got, passionately in love with the subjects I did for A-level. I had a couple of really great teachers who made a big difference to me. One teacher was a guy called John Temple, who he'd been a teacher for many years. He taught history, which is one of the A-levels I did. He also taught government and politics as well. It was quite a sort of shoestring operation, my sixth form college. And he was really inspiring to me. And then I had an English literature teacher. That was the other A-level that I did, called John Bentley, who was a real kind of sort of laid back, sort of 1960s kind of hippie, who was really just encouraged us to read the stuff and talk about it. So I had a really, really good A-level education, did spectacularly well, unexpectedly well, and then went to Birmingham University and again had a great experience there studying politics, had some really inspiring teachers. Got to the end of my degree and I managed to get a place on a master's program funded then by the Economic and Social Research Council, the ESRC, which at the time funded master's programs where the student had the choice. So you would decide where you wanted to go and then you would apply for the funding. It's very, very different now. And once I got there, in London, I went to the London School of Economics, LSE, to do a master's in politics. And then it just seemed like a natural development to me to go on to do a PhD. So it was really, when I was about halfway through my master's program, that's when I thought, you know what, I've got a shot at this. But the entry qualification to being a lecturer is the PhD. Mm. So I needed to get the PhD. And looking back, there's one big thing that made a difference. And I definitely wouldn't be here today if I hadn't have got it. It was the funding for the master's program that I managed to get because of really good reference from the University of Birmingham in the politics department. And then particularly a professor called Len Tivy, who was on the verge of retirement at the time, who took me under his wing and was really supportive. And it was that moment when I got that funding that, because that then led to the application for the further funding for the PhD. Without that funding for the master's, I wouldn't be here because I simply couldn't have afforded to do the master's. It's as simple as that. I would have had to have got a job. My parents couldn't afford to, to subsidise me, apart from the odd, pint down the local pub on a weekend when my dad came to visit occasionally, but that was it. So it was, I had no idea. I literally had no inkling at all until it was that moment of getting the funding, but then also going to London and then realizing that this was something that I wanted to do. So I did my PhD and then got a lectureship, and the rest is history.
You must have collected some fun stories along the way. Have you got any kind of like standout moments during this journey? So any kind of weird and wonderful projects that you worked on, or any fun places you've got to visit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always sort of a bit wary because what an academic considers to be fun. Maybe most members of society might not find all that funny, but yeah, I mean, a few I've had. I think probably the best kind of sort of exciting experience was when I was doing the field work for my book called The Hybrid Media System. I was based in London and I was doing it. The field work involved a lot of in-depth qualitative interviews with people working at the real kind of coalface of senior politics in senior level politics in the UK. So it was senior journalists such as Laura Kuenssberg, for instance, who at the time when I interviewed her she'd moved from her role as political correspondent at the BBC to ITV, and then she went back to be political editor at the BBC. But I interviewed her, and I was traveling around. It was really exciting time for me, but also chaotic because, on one day I was kind of literally inside number 10 Downing Street, interviewing members of the digital press team there, actually inside number 10, which was incredibly exciting. I still feel privileged really to have had that opportunity. And then I was interviewing people at the BBC. I was interviewing people in ITV. I was talking to people at The Guardian, some of whom were on the record, some of whom were off the record. And I think that, I think probably that interview with Laura Kuenssberg for me was a real standout one, because she gave me like nearly an hour of her time. And she was very, at the time, I remember she was very, controversial as a journalist because of her use of social media. So it was at a time when not many journalists were really taking to the use, particularly of Twitter, in the way that she was. And she taught me through the whole kind of background experience to some of the arguments she'd had with the editorial team inside BBC. I mean, it was all very gentle, and all of the material made it into the book and there were no complaints. There are two things that I've often noticed over the years when it comes to field work. One is that people who are in positions of power and influence are often actually very willing to open up to you, sometimes off the record, sometimes on the record, sometimes with a bit of a mix. As a former journalist yourself, you'll know how important that mix can be to getting to the story. But the second thing I've also been really lucky with over the years is ordinary members of the public opening up and devoting their time to completing, whether it's surveys. We've done a lot of work based on surveys over the last 10 years, but I'm just coming to the end of a big round of qualitative interviews with over 100 members of the public as part of this big new project that I'm involved in, where we've got people, who are very willing to sit for an hour and 15 minutes and really open up about their social relationships, their uses of media, their exposure to misinformation, how they make sense of problematic information. I'm always surprised by just how nice and sort of easy it is at times to be a researcher. You go in there with this idea, it's going to be really difficult, I'm going to have to be very careful. But actually, you find that people are willing to sort of get out of their everyday experience and talk to you, often in quite abstract ways and in ways that I find really exciting. And I think for me, that's the fun of it all over the last sort of 25 years of my research career, is sort of dealing with real people and listening to them speak. And I think that all social scientists are like this, actually. I think that we've all got that fascination and curiosity, like, why why does the world work the way that it does? You know, tell me about this and how you make sense of it. And I think that for me is what it's always been about.
Love that. And I completely agree. Chatting with people is the best part of my job, especially when you get to have a tea.
Yeah, exactly.
Great answer.
Yeah.
So have there been any kind of lows on your academic journey, or have you faced any difficulties? I know you mentioned about the master's funding, but maybe as you've progressed through that, what have you found difficult?
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, given what I just said there about engaging with real people. Because I was thinking about this, because I'm familiar with obviously the format of the great award-winning Cuppa with a Scientist podcast. So I'd given this some thought before we started. I think probably the darkest time for me was actually, and I'll say a little bit more about this because, you know, some listeners and viewers might be thinking about doing a PhD. So I think it's important. When I was in the middle of my PhD, I was doing, now my PhD was quite historical. I did a lot of archival work because it was a study of movements for democratic reform in the early 20th century in Britain. So I was looking at sort of votes for women campaigners, you know, feminists campaigning for the vote. I was looking at early Labour and socialist politicians and liberal politicians and activists and what the arguments they were trying to make about why democracy was important. And I was looking at their very rich and varied kind of set of communication outlets, you know, whether it was local newspapers, small kind of activist publications, pamphlets, a very sort of rich culture, but it involved a lot of archival work. And I think I got about 6 months in to archival work. It gives you an idea of how long it was. At the British Library's newspaper library in North London, as it was then. It was in a suburb of North London called Colindale, and it was absolutely legendary among anybody who studied essentially political history or media history, because it was where the entire archive of the British Library's newspaper archive in paper form, long before digitization, it was where that was stored. Now, I spent a lot of time in the old reading room in central London in the British Library, but that was very sort of glamorous. You know, it was the big circular building. You can go there now, you know, have a look around. But at the time, it was a working room. And it was where Karl Marx used to write. You know, we all had I enjoyed spending time there because it was in Bloomsbury and it was fairly glamorous. And you'd sort of see the occasional kind of famous author, you know, like Germaine Greer. I once saw Germaine Greer in the British Library in the reading room, which was quite interesting in the summer. But the Colindale Library was something different. I mean, it was pretty grim, to be honest with you. And it just took forever. And I spent so long in there. And I remember thinking, you know, I was in that real kind of trough of the PhD where I couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. I think for me, that taught me a lot. The reason why it taught me a lot is that I did reach the end of the tunnel and I did come out the other side, and it taught me about the peaks and the troughs of research and how the research experience, you know, some days you can be elated and think, great, real breakthrough. But then other days, you know, you have these moments of doubt and you're thinking, am I going to get through this? Because I think in any creative job, there is this kind of tension between the good times and the less good times. But my advice would be to persevere, because it does pay off. You know, the hard work does pay off, and it might seem like it's unending, but it is all worth it. And I think that's stood me in good stead as I've gone through the years and I've worked on long-term projects such as books, you know, in particular, where, you know, sometimes they take 4 or 5 years to bring to fruition. So that for me was a dark time, but it ended up as part of a happier experience, which is completing my PhD and getting it and carrying on.
So I've had a look at your website, which for listeners, it's www.andrewchadwick.com. And I've pulled a selection of projects that I'd like to hear a bit more about, please. if we can just kind of give an overview on what they aim to achieve, that kind of thing. So first of all, could you tell me a bit more about the Understanding the Everyday Sharing of Misinformation project, please? Where are you at with that? What are kind of the findings? Just a nice little snapshot into it.
The essence of that project is really started out thinking with my colleague, Professor Christian Bakari, around about 2018, early 2019, that these personal messaging apps, particularly WhatsApp, were exploding, becoming far more important. And indeed, in the UK context now, WhatsApp is used by far more people than use any public social media platforms, including Facebook, which is the big heavyweight platform, of course, still, although it's on the decline now, but Instagram as well. So WhatsApp is used by about 2/3 of the adult population in the UK on a regular basis. And during the last few years, there's been the occasional commentary, usually in the form of journalists, writing news articles based upon small samples of people who they've interviewed, about how misinformation spreads very easily across this platform, particularly WhatsApp, but also the private side of Facebook, which is Facebook Messenger, which is actually a different part of Facebook from the main public part of it. So we started to think about this and think, well, this is an area that's not very easy to study. You can't access the data as readily. There's lots of studies of Twitter, for instance, a public platform, because it's so easy to extract the data and analyze it. Some would argue, I think I support this view now, that there are probably too many studies of Twitter because of the accessibility of the data, and it just makes it an easier thing to study. We wanted to get away from that and to examine these much more difficult to study environments, which are often very intimate, very personal, very private. You can't get access to people's WhatsApp data because it's encrypted end to end and there is no public archive. So this presents a real challenge methodologically. And so what we wanted to do was really have 3 strands to this project. And as I say, the Loughborough Trust were really generous in funding it. And it's a 3-year project. That started last April 2021. The start was delayed due to the pandemic. We had to redesign all of the qualitative field work. But it's got 3 strands to it. The first is in-depth qualitative interviews with members of the public that we've recruited via a national opinion polling company called Opinion Research that we've done quite a lot of work with over the years. They've been great supporters of our projects, and also one of their senior managers actually is a Loughborough graduate, graduated in English. So she reached out to me in 2018 and said, we've noticed you're founding the new research centre, can we help in any way? So I said, yeah, actually. And so they've let us run surveys. But anyway, with this one, we got the funding and we hired them to recruit people who were a cross-sectional representation of the British public. So people from lots of different walks of life, across 3 regions, however, because we wanted that local emphasis. We wanted to try and explore how the neighbourhood makes a difference. People's local contacts are very important when it comes to these apps. So we looked at the northeast of England, which is where I was born and grew up. We looked at the East Midlands, the area obviously where Loughborough is located, and we looked at London. And it's a series of interviews. So each participant had 2 interviews. So we did 102 interviews in the first phase, and then we did follow-ups with 80 of those. Longitudinal work like this is quite hard because people have different priorities, but we managed to retain 80 of the 102. That was the first aspect. The second aspect is that we asked people to install an app on their smartphones. And when they came across examples of information that they thought was false or misleading, we asked them, while paying attention to anonymity and all the rest of it, to take a screen grab or speak into their phone to tell a story about what the piece of information was, and then upload it to a server so that we can analyze those data. And then the final aspect of it, which is what we're hoping to start probably December, January time, we're going to take the findings from the first 2 phases and then design national surveys with some survey experiments as well to take these ideas up and test them at the level of the UK population. So the big challenge, as I say, about studying personal messaging apps is that you can't get access to the data directly. So you've got to think about the methods that you can use to get inside these moments when people are kind of making decisions on what to forward, what to share, what to respond to, what not to respond to, because conflict avoidance is a big theme that we found in this study so far. So we had this combination of three main methods, and the first two of those are now complete, and we're working on the first set of findings. We've published some findings already, and then the third phase is where we take it up to the level of national population level surveys, where we can generalize about the British population.
Other projects that you've listed on your website, I'm going to have to read this one off so I get the name right. The New Crisis of Public Communication, Challenges and Opportunities for Future Research on Digital Media and Politics. And there's another project called the Oxford Coronavirus Attitudes, Explanations and Narratives Project, or OCEANS. Could you again give like a bit of an overview of both of those, please, and what they're looking to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, the second of those, I'll start with that first, because this is a project that I've been really proud to be involved in. During the early stages of the pandemic, there were some rather worrying signs, you know, that various conspiracy theories and other forms of misinformation were circulating about the origins of the virus, about issues around, government control and things like this. And I remember seeing a news article that was published on the back of a press release that Oxford University put out. And it was a psychologist called Daniel Freeman, Professor Daniel Freeman there. And they'd run this survey and found some really quite startling findings about levels of belief and endorsement of belief in and endorsement of conspiracy theories about coronavirus. So and this gives you an example of how academic life works increasingly these days and how collaboration is formed. I sent him an email just out of the blue and thought that was really interesting. It reminds me of a survey that we ran last year on news sharing, where we'd found that about 40% of the British public who share news on social media admitted in our survey that they'd shared news that they thought was exaggerated or false or made up. And we got, with that report, quite a lot of coverage, because it's one of those things where the statistical finding, the percentages kind of really leap out, and journalists are really interested in that kind of thing because it's an instant hit with a story. And so I just mentioned this to Daniel, and he said, "Oh, thanks very much for the email. We're working on a new project. You want to get involved?" And so we had a meeting and ended up getting involved in this big multi-strand study looking at COVID vaccine hesitancy. So this was just at the stage where the vaccines for COVID were being developed, and there was a lot of uncertainty around the clinical trials, and also there were a lot of conspiracy theories flying around about the nature of the vaccine program. So we put together a team, Daniel put together a team of all kinds of different natural scientists and social scientists. So Sir Andrew Pollard, who was one of the members of the Oxford Vaccine Group who developed the Oxford vaccine, he was in charge of the clinical trials for that. He was involved in it. Daniel was involved. Several of his colleagues in psychology at Oxford. I was involved. My colleague Christian Bakari, who is fellow professor of communication at Loughborough, we were involved. There were economists on there. There was an ethical philosopher. There were people with a background in social psychology, such as Steve Lewandowski, who's at Bristol University. It was really exciting projects, and we were operating literally at 100 miles an hour, developing ideas, developing surveys, putting them into the field with very big samples and publishing the results very quickly. We put the first survey based paper out in December, early December 2020, just as the vaccine program was rolling out. And it pointed to the problems that are associated with vaccine hesitancy. So things like belief in conspiracy theories, distrust of government, distrust of health authorities and public authorities in general, social inequality. These are the main factors which drive vaccine hesitancy. And then off the back of that, we put out several other studies, one of which I led on, where we looked at the role of social media in enabling people to spread their negative views of the vaccines in an attempt to influence other people to not get vaccinated. And that was a paper that came out in early 2021. And then we also did a big experiment looking at different messages and how they would potentially shape people's decision to get vaccinated or not get vaccinated. So we had this huge sample of about 18,000 people that we ran in a survey experiment, testing 10 different kinds of messaging. Incredibly exciting project, which fed into, at the time, government advisory work that I was involved in. I was involved in something called the Counter Disinformation Policy Forum, which was set up by the government, involving a number of departments, culture, media and sport, but also the Cabinet Office, Department of Health and Social Care. And one of our major focus points was the vaccine program. So we've got 2 years worth of findings that have provided a really, I think anyway, very sort of solid evidence-based way to assess the problem of COVID vaccine hesitancy. The problem itself hasn't gone away because we've still got, new vaccines that are about to be rolled out. We've got an incredibly complicated patchwork now of messaging that we have to think about, because we've got some people who had one jab but didn't get the second, some who had two didn't get the booster, some who had the booster but then didn't get boosted again. And as we know, the immunity wanes and some groups are more vulnerable than others. So I see it as a really interesting development in my research. I found it incredibly exciting to kind of get involved in thinking about how communication can make a concrete difference and can improve social well-being and public health in a very tangible way. And I think that that's been one of the lessons of the pandemic, actually, that I think lots of people in the social sciences have learned, is that actually, when you get these big moments of social, economic crisis, public health crisis, cast your mind back to what it was like in March and April, May 2020. I mean, extraordinary period. I've never lived through anything like it. I don't really want to live through anything like that again, to be honest with you. That actually the social sciences as a whole become really relevant. But communication as a field, I think, became super, super relevant. And it's quite a proud moment, I think, for everybody who's been working on problems of misinformation over the last 5 or 6 years, to have those kinds of findings all of a sudden become super relevant, I think shows the value of the social sciences, and in particular shows the value of communication as a field. So it was a great privilege to be involved with that. And it's something that I've carried on with one of the publications from the new project, which is looking at people's sharing of information and misinformation on COVID vaccines on personal messaging, which is a public report we put out in the spring.
Brilliant. Loads of really fascinating research going on. Always very excited when I get your emails with your findings in them. Is there any other projects you want to give a bit of an overview of what you're doing there?
One of the things that's come out of the Leverhulme funded Everyday Misinformation project on personal messaging is that we asked people who participated in the qualitative interviews, the wave 1 and wave 2 in-depth qualitative interviews that we started last year and have just finished. We asked them to tell us about their experiences of seeing people posting into their personal messaging interactions, whether it's groups or one-to-ones, small groups, large groups, their experiences of seeing misinformation about COVID vaccines and how they themselves personally responded to it. So one of the things that we found that was really interesting, very common finding across most of the participants, was this theme of conflict avoidance. And it seems, on the one hand, you know, as a social scientist who studies misinformation, I think we often forget that what seems straightforward to us, you know, a matter of scientific fact and accuracy, which is that COVID vaccines are safe and effective, and there is a global scientific consensus on that, that nevertheless people's social relationships often get in the way of that information circulating and getting into the corners of people's lives where it really needs to be. So conflict avoidance is one of those things that we all encounter in our everyday interactions, you know, whether it's with our friends, our family. You don't want to be having arguments with people all the time, because at the end of the day, you know, that's not what being a friend or a family member is all about. So what we found is that this conflict avoidance really does get in the way of people challenging, speaking up against misinformation about vaccines in their personal messaging. And the upshot of all of this, the outcome, is that these misperceptions and this misinformation tends to circulate more freely than we'd like to admit, because people don't feel confident about calling it out for all kinds of reasons to do with their social relationships. They don't want to fall out with people. They don't want to stand out as being the person who's, you know, awkward, or is pointing something out that somebody said, or is judging somebody. So these kind of social dynamics in this project, we argue that they've been really badly neglected by a lot of the research on misinformation, because a lot of the research on misinformation just says, well, if you put the right information in front of people, you know, there are lots of different ways to do it, but as long as you get the information in front of people and expose them to it, doesn't matter whether you do it, you know, early or late, or through social media or whatever, but it's a sort of rational information-based model of correction. What we're arguing actually is that there's a whole layer beneath that, which is to do with people's social relationships, that are really important in determining whether misinformation spreads or not, and they haven't really been studied. And I think a good way to study them is these personal messaging apps, where these social relationships matter a lot more, because people interact with friends and family, people they know quite well, people they know maybe not so well, but they still know them well enough to communicate with them on personal messaging. So that report was really interesting to write, and it's continued my interest in public health communication and tackling misinformation that I would argue is really quite damaging and harmful. You know, we can have an argument about political misinformation, and there's a big debate about, you know, whether people are more likely to share misinformation just because it agrees with their political viewpoint, and that's a big debate. But I think with this particular field of health misinformation, I think that the ethical mission of researchers is much clearer, because misinformation does ultimately, if it's adopted by people, can cost lives and can really damage people's personal experiences and damage their health. So I think it's really important that we pay attention to these social aspects of the spread of misinformation, because it could make a difference to how people are exposed to misinformation, and it could reduce the spread of misinformation on these personal messaging apps.
Really interesting stuff. And I know when I read about this, it definitely made me view the WhatsApp groups I'm in differently and more conscious of how and why people are talking certain ways. So very interesting. So in addition to all this research that you're doing, the undergraduate, director of the Online Civic Culture Centre, like so much going on, but you're also an author and you also regularly engage with the media. And it's the latter that I kind of want to touch on a little bit, because I think a lot of people that aspire to work in academia don't necessarily think about that kind of aspect, that you engage with the public through the media. So I just wanted to ask you how you find it working with the media. Is it something that you think is important for scientists to do, and why?
I like to base any kind of outreach with press on actual research findings. I think that there can be a bit of a tendency to respond to every last query. So, we get, as you know, working in the press office, the university gets multiple requests for commentary, as any organization working in the field of knowledge production does in any given day. And I think we've got to be careful to base what we want to communicate on actual research findings where there is something genuinely interesting and solid and important to report. That being said, there are occasions, quite a few, when I will get inquiries from journalists, usually journalists working in print outlets like newspapers, where they'll just say, can I have a quick interview? I want to get your take on it. I'm writing a report about, Joe Biden's presidential campaign or whatever, and I want to get an expert take on what he's doing in his comms. And so with those kinds of things, I tend to privilege the ones where it's going to be in the printed form, or on a website, on a news website, or in the printed version of the newspaper, and where I get enough time to reflect and think, and where the journalist doesn't want sort of commentary or an interview within an hour or two, because there's often that kind of short-termism. So I tend to sort of say no to the ones where I'm going to be in a terrible hurry, because I'm always really busy and I often can't just sort of drop everything. I tend to prioritize the ones where somebody's planning a piece, where it's perhaps a longer piece, maybe not a straightforward sort of just immediate piece of research where where people have decided to report on a very fast-moving event. So yeah, I do enjoy doing that kind of thing where I get the time. I also get quite a few inquiries from journalism students as well. We don't have a journalism program at Loughborough. We don't teach people to be journalists. We do communication and media analysis as a social science subject. But occasionally I do get requests from trainee journalists who are looking to put a story in their portfolio and they want to interview somebody as part of that, and I occasionally get involved in those as well. So I do enjoy it, but as I say, over the years I've learned to try and prioritize and not sort of end up responding to everything. I always try and respond and say sorry, I don't have time, but sometimes I'll have to say no. But as I say, I think a good rule of thumb, and I know that this is the way that my colleagues think as well. So if you look at some of the great press work that my colleague James Stanyard, David Deacon, Dominic Ring have done over the years with their great election reports where they do content analysis of media, it's always based on findings, and it's based upon, they might not be peer-reviewed articles, but I think it's always a bonus if they are. But public reports that you put out that are rigorous, that are well constructed, that are evidence-based, as long as there's something there that's solid, I think that's the best approach, rather than just becoming a talking head.
That's some really good advice for people, academics already working in the industry, but also people thinking of getting into academia as well, because I think it can be quite a daunting area for people. So some good advice. So we're going to finish the show by doing some quick fire questions. So I hope you're ready, Andy, because it's going to be fast.
Yeah.
Describe being a professor of political communication in 3 words.
Right. Incredibly interesting and rewarding.
Nice.
4 words.
We'll take it. What are the not so glamorous parts?
It's all glamorous.
Love it. I often get admin as an answer for stuff like this, but
No, it's all glamorous.
love that. What's the weirdest thing you've ever had to do as part of the job?
The weirdest experience I've ever had, I tell you, and unfortunately it's a bit of a humble brag as well. I was invited to give a talk in Portugal in 2015, and it was quite a big kind of conference, but it was held at a famous building in Portugal called the Casa da Música, which is in the centre of Porto. And it's a huge kind of fabulous modern building. And I didn't realize how big it was. I'd seen pictures of it. I went in there, we did a dress rehearsal in the morning because it was all quite a scripted event. And I looked at the stage at the front and I looked back and it was just these rows and rows and rows of seats. And I said to the person, so how many people are you expecting? And he said, yeah, it'll be full. Yeah. There'll be 1,500 people. So I couldn't believe it. I thought, no, you're completely wrong. Anyway, sure enough, when it came to the event, it was absolutely packed, and it was the biggest audience I've ever spoken in front of. And I literally had no idea that it was going to be that big and that full. But it was, because the Portuguese did a really great job of organizing the conference. So that's really the weirdest experience I've ever had. And it was good. It all went really well, but it was just genuinely one of those moments where, when you get invited to give a talk, you think, well, there might be 100 people there and it'll be some academics. But it was full of people from the city, young and old, from all kinds of different walks of life. They had a huge lunch that they gave them in the sort of lower ground floor of the building. It was just superbly well organized.
That's rock star status, that is.
It was. I mean, it was the biggest. Yeah, I think in my younger days when I was in a band and played guitar, I think the biggest crowd we ever played to was about 250. And so, yeah, I did feel like a rock star, and it went well. Of course, I'm not a rock star, and I absolutely didn't perform like a rock star on the day, but it was a real shock, but it ended up going really well. Yeah.
Great answer. What keeps you motivated?
Yeah, I think it's because it's just such a fast-moving field that there's always something new around the corner. And I think that's one of the things that we struggle with, actually, in my field in particular, because I've studied the internet and digital media and political communication, and I was there, 23, 24 years ago when there weren't many of us. But over the last, particularly the last 10 to 15 years, the field has completely exploded, and now it's become almost impossible to keep track of. I mean, the amount of new research that's being published in my field every day, I just can't possibly keep on top of it. So that makes it very, very exciting, actually, to always be looking at a kind of moving target, but it's also a challenge as well.
And what would you say is your ultimate dream or goal for your career? You've obviously achieved so much, but is there an ultimate one?
Not really. I mean, not beyond what I've achieved so far. I mean, it is a cliche, but I do tend to take every day as it comes. And sometimes things go in your favor, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you get a lucky break and things end up going in an interesting direction, as I explained earlier with the COVID vaccines project. I don't really have any burning ambition beyond maintaining what I'm doing. I mean, I can't imagine doing anything else at this point in time. So if I can just keep up what I'm doing now, then I'm happy.
I like that. That's a really nice answer. And what does a professor of political communication do in their spare time? What hobbies have you got?
Yeah, I mean, I just do the sort of the boring usual things, really. I like to go to the pub. I like to cook. I like to go, on holiday at the coast with my family. We've got a dog, that we take for walks. I live just outside Loughborough, so in the countryside, and it's really nice. And Yeah, nothing major. I mean, my main interests outside of academic life, I think, probably are things like architecture and design, art. I do enjoy fiction, like novels, but I don't read as much as I used to. I think part of the novels, that is, I think part of the reason there is that I spend so much of my day reading or writing that often I don't see reading for pleasure in the way that I used to when I was younger. Perhaps I need to get back into that. But anything visual, I enjoy art, architecture. My big passion over many, many years, anybody who knows me will know, is music. And I'm interested in music in all of its great variety. I used to play guitar when I was younger. As I say, I was a failed pop musician in the 1980s and early 1990s. Yeah, I mean, some people say that I've kind of channeled that into my academic life, and then I have to tell them that no, it really is very, very different from being in a band and playing the guitar and singing and things like that. But yeah, so it's a mixture of things, really. One of the things that I will say finally about this job, and if you talk to anybody in the field, and I think anybody who's going into the social sciences, is that you never really get a break from your job. And what I mean by that is that you're always thinking about the world, about what's going on. So if I'm listening to the news, or if I'm reading on the radio or watching TV, or I'm looking at the news websites in the morning, I'm always thinking about my job, because my job is to make sense of all of that. And I think that I enjoy that most of the time. But what it means is that sometimes your job can be your hobby as well. So yeah, you've got to be a bit careful, I think. And I think most of my colleagues would agree with me on this, is that it's a real blessing of the job that it's always really relevant, and you're always thinking about how to think about new research questions and things that are important, but also it can be something that you've got to manage. So when I'm not doing my work and I'm doing other things, I like to do things that are quite unrelated. So yes, I mean, that's it really. I mean, I don't have any, I'm not a sort of amateur wood turner or anything like that. I do a bit of DIY, but that's about it.
No, I think that's a good variety of hobbies. What's your go-to dish to cook then? I know you mentioned cooking.
Well, I do all the cooking in our house. I mean, my wife is a big baker. My daughter is now as well, but I do most of the kind of savoury dishes, just because I've got interested in it over the years. I do find it, you can kind of switch off for half an hour and just do something completely different with your hands, and you kind of, you're in a different environment. So I think that's why I enjoy it. I'm a big lover of Chinese food, in particular. That's how I learned to cook when I was at university. I went to university in Birmingham, where there are a lot of great Chinese restaurants, and spent a lot of time in them, and then trying to reproduce the dishes in our student flats and student houses. And so that stayed with me. One of the reasons why I love the Midlands so much is that we've got a big Chinese community, both in the West Midlands and in the East Midlands as well. And so there's some really great Asian grocers in Nottingham, in Leicester, where you can get all the ingredients. And so I enjoy that.
You're a lucky family having you cooking Chinese food for them. So moving on, what areas do you think will be the hot topics for the next generation of people going into political communications?
Yes, I think my sense is that we're about to go through a new kind of phase. I think we've gone, certainly my field, with the field of the internet and politics, we've gone through lots of optimism, and then we've gone through this terrible crash into pessimism, and all of the work about misinformation, online hate, incivility, since 2016. My sense is that we're about to come out the other side of that very shortly, with not a return to the kind of naive optimism that we saw in the early days, but instead a kind of sort of hard-headed but positive and productive approach to how to handle some of the aspects of digital media that we didn't predict. So my view is that what's likely to be big for the next 5 years is people looking for concrete solutions to the problem of online misinformation, but also trying to encourage the more positive aspects of online engagement, such as, for social justice, social movements, activism. Feminist movement has been changed radically, for instance, by the internet in all kinds of positive ways, despite the growth, for instance, of misogyny and online hate speech aimed at women. So I think, and Black Lives Matter as well, I think is a great example of that double-edged sword, where there's lots of racism absolutely online, but we've had that amazing fight back, collective action in the form of Black Lives Matter. My view is we're about to come out of this period of very, very gloomy pessimism into something that is more positive and constructive, and about constructing positive solutions for improving online communication much more over the next 5 years.
Well, that sounds really interesting. Definitely watch that space. So one of your final questions, do you have any words of wisdom for those aspiring to be like you, or is there anything you wish someone had told your younger self?
Well, my only advice really is to follow your passions, and don't be too conservative with a small c. Try and be bold. And if you think you've got a good idea, but it seems a bit far out, or a bit of a deviation from the norm in the field, don't be afraid to try and develop it. Because I think with the book that I've enjoyed most working on was my book called The Hybrid Media System, that started out as a research project in 2011 and then led to the book in 2013, and then a second edition in 2017. And it's probably the work that I'm most well known for. But the great pleasure of that for me is that I had an idea. It didn't seem to fit with the mainstream of what was going on in the field at the time, and I did feel slightly trepidatious and nervous about pushing ahead with it. But I'm really glad I did, because I found it a really, really interesting project, and I'm still dealing with the kind of conceptual framework that came out of that, and it's inspiring me in all kinds of ways. So that's what I'd say. I'd say try and think boldly, and then build yourself a platform that then you can use to stand the rest of your work on as something that's distinctive and that helps people to understand things in ways that they haven't perhaps understood them before. That would be my advice.
I like that. Be bold, be very bold. So thank you so much for taking the time to have a cuppa with us, have a chat. Before we go, is there anything you want to plug? Website, Twitter, anything like that?
No, I think I've done enough plugging, to be honest with you. Well, thanks for putting up with that.
No problem. We have mentioned your website in this, and we'll make sure we hyperlink it below as well. But thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you all for listening or watching this episode of Cuppa with a Scientist. I hope you found it interesting and will join us again. Do leave a comment and get in touch. I'd love to hear your feedback and thoughts on who you'd like to see on the show. And make sure you don't miss a show by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other mainstream podcast platforms. You can also subscribe to the Loughborough University YouTube channel if you prefer to watch the show. See you next time for more hot tea and even hotter stories to help you on your way to becoming a scientist.